Majority Report with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, November 14th, 2019. My name is Sam Seder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We're broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Democrats score on day one of impeachment hearings and all that jazz. Federal appeals court rules Congress can seek 8 years of Donald Trump's taxes. Meanwhile, speaking of Donald Trump, the U.S. held almost 70,000 migrant children in 2019. Infants, toddlers, elementary school kids. And in Bolivia, a Bolivian theocratic lawmaker declares herself president. Meanwhile, in this country, the Supreme Court allows Sandy Hook victims to go ahead with their suit against the Remington gun manufacturer. It's a big deal. On the campaign trail, Deval Patrick jumps in the race, joining John Delaney in the Finance Caucus. Republicans nervous about the Louisiana governor race this weekend. Trump's plan to drill on federal land in Utah halted by a lawsuit. Lastly, AOC and Sanders introduce a Green New Deal for public housing. And then, in a format change, an interview with Stephen Kinzer, author of Poisoner-in-Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. All this and more on today's program. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. We have a skeletal crew today. Michael's out, Jamie out, and we've got to do. Obviously, we're starting a little bit early today. We're going to do the show in reverse order for the live folks, but we will flip it for the freebies. As always, you can become a member of this program by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, you support the free show. You also get extra content every day. And you also get the free show commercial free. Okay, so yesterday we did a bunch of streaming. Obviously, you can go back. We have 2 segments that cover, I would say, about 90% of the hearings yesterday. And any of the highlights from that we did not get to, we will touch upon today. But the main gist of it was the Democrats wanted to do 2 things yesterday. And I will give a little bit of an analysis in a bit as to what I think their strategy was about. But they wanted to do 2 things. It was quite clear. One is they wanted to communicate to some audiences that the U.S., the implications of what Donald Trump did were, the stakes were high in terms of our relationship and the importance of our relationship and U.S. foreign policy toward Ukraine. And largely, George Kent, a State Department official, delivered that message. He had other things to talk about, but that was the big part that he needed, that he was brought in, I think, why they had him on day one. And then it was Ambassador Bill Taylor, who was the U.S. diplomat to Ukraine. And he was brought in to basically say, over time, I realized there was a two-track foreign policy with Ukraine. One, which represented U.S. foreign policy. The other, the irregular, he called them, that represented Donald Trump's personal interests. And I recognized when they started to diverge, these two tracks, and I came to understand what was going on. And he delivered that very well. The Republicans largely did not seem to be aware that this was going to happen yesterday. To the extent that they were successful at anything, I think they did make a case that Hunter Biden is a bit of a fail son and that we have a problem in this country with people trading off of their name and monetizing it, which I think is a fair assessment, largely irrelevant to the question of impeachment, but not so much if you're a Fox News viewer. And here's the point. Fox News, we got something similar to this, or this is Fox News Now. And they wanted, one of the things that was quite clear during the impeachment hearings, and it started very, very early, was you saw a lot of conservatives tweeting out, boring, very boring. And this was the line that was taken by the Republicans and the conservatives. This was their strategy from the beginning. Let's convince people not to watch it because it's boring. And after the fact, let's convince people that nobody watched it. It was irrelevant because it was boring. And here is Bill Bennett. They brought him on. I took him out of retirement. I don't know what Bill Bennett is doing now.
He's got a Fox Nation show.
Oh, he does? Okay,
Yeah.
well, there you go.
At Steve Wynn's casino, where they sit in a round table and just talk.
Oh, is that right?
Talk shop.
Well,
yeah.
Steve Wynn doesn't own that casino anymore. We sure that show's still on?
Maybe not with Steve Wynn. After.
Right. Well, I mean, the bottom line is now the reason why they brought Bennett on here was because Bill Bennett was a Republican sort of pillar, and he was at one point the Secretary of Education, I think, under one of the Bushes, and it was subsequently found that he had a massive gambling problem that reached into, I think, millions of dollars, and that he was also apparently going to Vegas to gamble and then hooking up with a dominatrix, and he was married, and so it was a little bit scandalous. If I remember, that was at least the alleged rumor about him with the dominatrix. And so they brought him on to talk about how, what it takes to make a scandal sexy. And here he is.
Americans are not buying the attacks on the president.
They're not buying the attacks and they're not interested. Look, this is a public event now, and there's no burglary, there's no break-in, there's no tapes, there's no dress, there's no sex, there's no Monica Lewinsky. Interest just isn't there.
Yeah.
Plus, most important, there's no crime.
Okay. Now, I have two responses to this. One is that we are going to do most of our coverage with some background music that will jazz things up a little bit. Let's just play a little sample of it. Yeah, we're going to do that as we do some of the coverage because I think it was Reuters said there wasn't, or it was an NBC. Here it is, analysis. The first two witnesses called Wednesday to testify to President Trump's scheme, but lacked the pizzazz necessary to capture public attention. And we saw something similar, I think, with Reuters, like that had to do with pizzazz. So we're going to add some of that pizzazz. The other thing to remember here is that I don't know what the ratings were for that. I don't really know whether the American public was paying attention or not. There is one very narrow audience that the Democratic impeachment is targeted towards. I don't think there's anybody out there who genuinely believes that impeachment will move the needle in the context of the 2020 presidential election. I don't know that anyone has ever said that. I think had the Democrats not done this, I think they would have dampened their own enthusiasm. But I don't think there was anybody who ever said, if they impeach Donald Trump, he's going to lose support. I think there have been people who said, if you impeach Donald Trump, you could actually help Donald Trump. There's no evidence of either thing that's happening. His approval ratings have not moved. I guess it's conceivable they could drop a little bit if they make the case. And I guess it's conceivable that they could go up if the Democrats had handled this really poorly. And it's quite clear that they're not. The audience for this are in purple states. And they are going to be potential voters. And I say this over and over again. And I'm going to keep saying it because I for some reason, I don't see anybody else saying it. And I'm surprised by that, which is not to say that I don't appreciate my own profundity, but I'm surprised that no one has made this point. When you talk about the importance of U.S. foreign policy towards Ukraine, when you talk about Bill Taylor's service to the United States in the military and whatnot, and Kent's long service as a part of the diplomatic corps, and as someone who is nonpartisan, you might as well be talking to the voter that Susan Collins is trying to reach, or the voter that Cory Gardner is trying to reach, or the voter that Joni Ernst wants to reach, or Sally McAdams wants to reach, or Tom Tillis wants to reach. There may be even in Georgia. I mean, the playing field could expand. And the problem with that is not so much that you're looking to even convince those people. They may not even be paying attention. But in 6 to 8 months from now, when Susan Collins is trying to distance herself from Donald Trump, when Cory Gardner is trying to distance himself from Donald Trump, when Joni Ernst is trying to distance herself from Donald Trump. Remember, Joni Ernst even said there should be an examination of this. I'm following Grassley's lead here. They don't want to be hugged too tightly by Donald Trump. They also don't want to be crapped on by Donald Trump. And so what their plan was until any of this happened was to sort of toe that line and bob and weave and be non-committal. But there's nothing that can commit you more than voting for or against impeachment of this president. And when Susan Collins votes not to impeach Donald Trump, and her opponent says, how could you vote to protect Donald Trump? His word versus the word of these distinguished people like Ambassador Taylor and, and George Kent. Guy wears a bow tie, for God's sakes. Susan Collins does not have the opportunity now to say that these people their testimony was in any way compromised. She is in a box. And what happened yesterday was that box got even harder and more rigid and less escape proof. That is what the whole import from a political standpoint will be in 2020. In the 2020 elections, it will be, and some congressional races too, I imagine, but mostly from the Senate perspective. Like I say, there would have been implications, I think, if Democrats had not done this, because I think that would have depressed some of the support for Democrats, broadly speaking, and it would have left a vacuum where Donald Trump and Bill Barr would be creating a whole myth now about 2016 that is now automatically debunked. And we have people debunking that every day on our TV now in sworn testimony. And I think there was a ethical, civic responsibility to do this. But in terms of electoral politics, all of its meaning is going to be in the Senate races. And we will talk more about that in a moment and start to crank up the all that jazz music. Let me tell you, one of today's sponsors is News Voice, which is the first ever entirely open, crowdsourced, and democratized platform for news. And you can download the app for free at newsvoice.com/majority. In a country where the vast majority of news is owned by the same 5 huge corporations, it's important for us to always pay attention to where our news is coming from, who owns which media outlets, what political biases may be in play, and that's exactly what News Voice helps you keep track of. News Voice is a free, crowdsourced website and mobile app that lets you create personal news feeds and maintain a clear picture of where your news is coming from and what political slants may exist. It helps you aggregate news from corporate outlets, international outlets, local news, and independent media. Hello. Giving you access to every side of every story. News Voice is fueled by its community of users who contribute to the platform by fact-checking, submitting stories, sources that are missing, upvoting stories, writing story summaries. It's one of the places I visit in the morning when I'm trying to collect stories of the day, and it gives me an opportunity to make sure that I've covered all my bases. You can also comment on stories. You debate politics with other members of the community. News Voice Play feature lets you listen to your personal news feed every day through customizable audio news playlists. It's your own personally tailored radio station for news. News Voice is a next-generation news aggregator and social media platform that values transparency, good journalism, and productive political discussions. Get totally free access by going to newsvoice.com/majority. Put a link underneath this video if you're watching on YouTube. Of course, we put one in the podcast description as well. Also, Cariuma. It marries old school designs with new school ethics. Oh, grab my sneaker, dude. They want the shoes you wear to be made responsibly, feel crazy comfortable, and provide effortless style. And hello, ladies and gentlemen, here they are. I'm keeping these babies clean because these are my going out on the town sneaks.
Like Lou Reed.
Right?
Yeah.
This is like the old school style. I love it. But more comfortable, a little more sport. And they make their sneakers by hand with premium natural materials, like their canvas, which is made from cotton sourced via fair trade initiatives, or, like I say, the cleaner premium leather, which is made with water that's been reused and treated with zero chemical waste output. Their outsole is even made out of raw natural rubber. Plus, their shipping is footprint balance. Their shipping footprint balance is zero. They offset, which is amazing considering they ship worldwide as well as here in the U.S. They even have express shipping and can deliver your shoes in just 2 to 3 business days. Then, if any reason they don't fit perfectly, you can return them free of charge. I'm loving these sneaks. And I showed them to my daughter. She said that was cool. Yep.
That's a okay boomer.
Exactly.
Instead of a okay boomer.
Well, I mean, it's not okay boomer. I'm not a boomer.
I know. But that's the joke.
Okay slacker. I know. Whatever. Okay boomer. But for a limited time, our listeners can get an exclusive 15% off your first pair of Cariuma sneakers. Go to cariuma.com/majority. Get 15% off. That's CARIUMA.com/majority. That's CARIUMA, cariuma.com/majority for 15% off today. All right, let's get into some clips. We'll do a little bit of a roundup of the impeachment hearings and a couple other clips, and then I got to get on the road. We rolled the interview that I did with Stephen Kinzer. Fascinating story about this guy, Sidney Gottlieb, and the CIA search for mind control. And also, disturbing, I think, is a fair way of putting that. All right, so here we are with impeachment. Again, I want you to place, in your mind, is there room for Susan Collins to be sitting here? And what's amazing is you hear nothing about what's going on in the Senate. And there is no doubt in my mind that the most intense viewing of this came from half a dozen to a dozen Senate offices, because they're trying to figure out, how do I justify this vote that I have to vote in support of Trump? Because remember now, if one Republican senator votes for impeachment, that person is going to F the rest of them. If Mitt Romney, that cowardly, snivelly coward, makes the calculation that his run for president in 2024 is incumbent upon him distancing himself from Donald Trump, he will vote to impeach. If he determines that there's no way I can win the presidency without Trumpistas in 2024, then he will vote against impeachment. Even if Susan, and if he was to vote for impeachment, Susan Collins would be dead in the water. I mean, how does Susan Collins not justify voting for impeachment? And if she votes for impeachment, she's going to lose 10% of her voting base on day one. They're in a very tough spot. So they're watching this and they're trying to see, maybe these witnesses will be ones that I could say like were crazy and really came off as completely wacky. Here is Ambassador Bill Taylor explaining this informal, irregular channel that he encountered.
At the same time, however, I encountered an irregular, informal channel of U.S. policymaking with respect to Ukraine, unaccountable to Congress, a channel that included then Special Envoy Kurt Volker, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, and, as I subsequently learned, Mr. Giuliani. I was clearly in the regular channel, but I was also in the irregular one to the extent that Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, including me in certain conversations. Although this irregular channel was well connected in Washington, it operated mostly outside of official State Department channels. The irregular channel began when Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, Secretary Perry, and Senator Ron Johnson briefed President Trump on May 23rd upon their return from President Zelensky's inauguration. The delegation was as enthusiastic as I would soon become about the new Ukrainian president and urged President Trump to meet with him early on to cement the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. But from what I understood from the participants, President Trump did not share their enthusiasm for a meeting with President Zelensky. When I arrived in Kyiv, the actions of both the regular and the irregular channels of foreign policy appeared to serve the same goal, a strong U.S.-Ukraine partnership. But it became clear to me by August that the channels had diverged in their objectives. As this occurred, I became increasingly concerned. In late June, both channels were trying to facilitate a visit by President Zelensky to the White House for a meeting with President Trump, which President Trump had promised in his congratulatory letter of May 29th. The Ukrainians were clearly eager for the meeting to happen. But during my subsequent communications with Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, they relayed to me that the president wanted to hear from Zelensky before scheduling the meeting in the Oval Office. It was not clear to me what this meant.
Pause it for 1 second. So let me just make a couple of things clear here. When Zelensky is elected, and he was an actor, literally, I think, playing the president of Ukraine. And there was such response to the corruption. And look, Ukraine has not been a state that has been as successful as other former Soviet states and or, I guess, client states. And the regime that, or I should say the administration that was ousted or lost the election, was more closely aligned in some respects to Paul Manafort. And Paul Manafort had basically made this argument to Trump that, by releasing information on my criminal activities, they were undercutting your campaign. And so Trump is mad, and he sets up these two channels. Now, there's no reason to have two channels unless you want to make it like one is a legit channel and the other is doing something that we can't really be too transparent about. So we're going to have the front and we're going to have the real operation. And Taylor was brought in on the real operation only to the extent that they needed him to not make any issues about stuff. And so for a long time, he thought he was under the impression they were working together. He didn't realize that this irregular channel had a different agenda. And that's where we are now.
Office. It was not clear to me what this meant. On June 27th, Ambassador Sondland told me during a phone conversation that President Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he, President Zelensky, was not standing in the way of investigations. I sensed something odd when Ambassador Sondland told me on June 28th that he did not wish to include most of the regular interagency participants in a call planned with President Zelensky later that day. Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, Secretary Perry, and I were on this call, dialing in from different locations. However, Ambassador Sondland said he wanted to make sure no one was transcribing or monitoring as they added President Zelensky to the call. Also, before President Zelensky joined the call, Ambassador Volker separately told the U.S. participants that he, Ambassador Volker, planned to be explicit with President Zelensky in a one-on-one meeting in Toronto on July 2nd. In that meeting, Ambassador Volker planned to make clear what President Zelensky should do to get the White House meeting. I did not understand what this meant, but Ambassador Volker said he would relay that President Trump wanted to see rule of law, transparency, but also specifically cooperation on investigations to get to the bottom of things.
All right, pause it. So now, what's happening is Taylor, we're watching almost in real time, okay? Not in real time, but he's retelling in real time. That he's on this call, and he's starting to this is not normal protocol. Why are we not transcribing this? What is Volker talking about? Volker says to other people on the call, the American constituency, guys, don't worry, I'm going to get explicit with Zelensky when I meet with him in person. In other words, you don't need to do that on the phone now. Okay? Now, Taylor's like, I don't follow this. Now, but everybody who hears Volker, who's in the know, they know what he's talking about. Oh, right. Okay. We're going to be on the QT about this because Volker's going to deliver the specific message. And what we're going to deliver, as Sondland says to everybody on the phone, we're going to deliver the sort of like the background message, which is sort of the general gist. Volker will go in and tell him specifically what we're talking about. Continue.
Cooperation on investigations to get to the bottom of things. Once President Zelensky joined the call, the conversation was focused on energy policy and the war in Donbass. President Zelensky also said he looked forward to the White House visit President Trump had offered in his May 29th letter. By mid-July, it was becoming clear to me that the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. elections. It was also clear that this condition was driven by the irregular policy channel I had come to understand was guided by Mr. Giuliani. In a regular NSC secure video conference call on July 18th, I heard a staff person from the Office of Management and Budget say that there was a hold on security assistance to Ukraine, but could not say why. Toward the end of an otherwise normal meeting, a voice on the call, the person was off screen, said that she was from OMB and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending on security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened. The irregular policy channel was running contrary to the goals of longstanding U.S. policy.
Okay, pause it. Now, so understand, Mick Mulvaney is the chief of staff, acting. Mick Mulvaney is the head of OMB, acting. This is when Taylor starts to realize that, wait a second, not only is the meeting conditioned upon this stuff, so too is the actual money that has been appropriated by Congress to go to Ukraine to help them fight the Russians. And he's starting to freak out, and he's starting to realize that there's more specificity to this request than just like get to the bottom of various things.
Rule of law.
Rule of law. Be good. He's starting to find out what be good means. All right, let's play a little more.
There followed a series of NSC-led interagency meetings, starting at the staff level and quickly reaching the level of cabinet secretaries. At every meeting, the unanimous conclusion was that the security assistance should be resumed, the hold lifted. At one point, the Defense Department was asked to perform an analysis of the effectiveness of the assistance. Within a day, the Defense Department came back with the determination that the assistance was effective and should be resumed. My understanding was that the Secretaries of Defense and State, the CIA Director, and the National Security Advisor sought a joint meeting with the President to convince him to release the hold, but such a meeting was hard to schedule, and the hold lasted well into September. On July 9th, in a phone call with then Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs Fiona Hill and Director of European Affairs Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman at the NSC, they tried to assure me that they were not aware of any official change in U.S. policy toward Ukraine, OMB's announcement notwithstanding.
All right, pause it. So, okay, basically what we just heard is all of the process that came after that, when everybody at these agencies who are all wondering, why is this money being held up? And everybody's looking around the table to everybody else, metaphorically, and saying like, wait, is this your agency doing this? No, it's not us. Is it you? No, it's not us. We all agree, right, that this money should go to Ukraine, that it's all consistent with stated U.S. policy that is a function of Congress. They appropriated this money. And everybody's looking around going like, what's the holdup? They don't know. And ultimately, Taylor realizes that the holdup is a function of these irregulars who are basically being guided by Rudy Giuliani. Now, with that established, there's one more part to this. How does Bill Taylor comes, we've established the part in the first testimony that we just played, that how Taylor came to understand, A, that there was a dual track in approaching Ukraine, that B, the second track was working basically to get the deliverable, which was a statement that the government of Ukraine is investigating the Bidens and that their own involvement in 2016 election. And then Taylor starts to realize they're holding up not just dangling a meeting with Donald Trump, they're also holding up the congressionally mandated, appropriated $400 million worth of defense funds that Ukraine desperately needs. So he puts all of this together over the course of several months. He then drops this bomb in his testimony. And this bomb is actually one that the Democrats are following up on. Apparently, after he gives his private deposition in October, he has a member of his staff say, I have something to add to this that I'd never told you about before, and just did not seem relevant to me, but now is a lot more relevant. And this is the big bombshell. Democrats are meeting with the person that he's going to be talking about, I think today or tomorrow, in private and taking a deposition. I have a feeling we'll see that person in public at one point. But here is Taylor basically dropping the one new piece of information. A lot of this stuff was just in his personal deposition, his private deposition. Here is the big piece of new information that I think was so key.
The United States gave the Ukrainians virtually no notice of the release, and they were livid. Although this was the first time I had seen the details of President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky, in which he mentioned Vice President Biden, I had come to understand well before then that investigations was a term Ambassadors Volker and Sondland used to mean matters related to the 2016 elections and to investigations of Burisma and the Bidens.
Pause it. Now, this is clip number 7, right? Okay. All right, here we go. Now, he just said he saw the readout from the July 25th call, but he had basically pieced things together prior to that.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv.
Pause it now for 1 second. Now understand, okay? Yermak is the assistant to Zelensky, who's the president of Ukraine. This is the day after Trump has been on the phone with Zelensky saying, I want you to do me a favor, though. Doing leaning on the stuff generally, has his capos essentially deliver the specifics. And so Taylor is separated from his staff. Staff member is with Sondland, who is the EU ambassador, but been messing around on this irregular channel.
Staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. At the time I gave my deposition on October 22nd, I was not aware of this information.
Okay, so there it is. Sondland's assessment of what Trump thinks about Ukraine is nothing. He just cares about the investigations into the Bidens. There's a lot of information in what he just delivered that undercuts all of the arguments that the Republicans have tried to offer. One is nothing happened. Well, it's quite clear, and they had no intention of doing it. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians were ready to make the deal. We'll make the deal. They have no choice. They have no choice. And at one point, Kent is asked, would it be likely, and I don't know if we have this clip, when Kent is asked, would the Ukrainians pretend that they were not intimidated by Donald Trump to avoid pissing off the United States? And Kent's like, yes. In fact, I talked to a reporter last night at MSNBC in the green room. Simon, I can't remember his last name, but he is a reporter for PBS who spends half his time in Ukraine. He said, absolutely. Of course. Of course they would be. They'd be very nervous about it. They were prepared to move. Donald Trump did not care about corruption. He cared about getting this information about Joe Biden. How do you respond to this if you're the Republican Party? Well, you can't. This is the best that they came up with in terms of this irregular channel diplomacy. Here is Steve Castor. He is the Republican counsel. Now, the Democrats did a great job yesterday in terms of like laying this out and planning it. They had, they basically, Schiff allowed for 45 minutes from each party to start off the hearings after the initial introductory remarks by the witnesses. The Democrats, Schiff asked a question or two, and then he ceded the rest of his time to this guy, Goldman. What was it? Daniel Goldman, who was an exceptional attorney in asking. And we'll see how he does when it comes time for when he has a hostile witness like a Sunderland next Wednesday. But the Republican counsel, this guy was working on Benghazi when I think it was just sort of like, it was a little bit more clear. They're just trying to create a fiction. But to knock down the truth, he's not so good. It was bizarre. Here's a perfect example of Steve Castor's inability to, it really did feel like this guy didn't, like he was just like hanging out playing video games. And he got a call like, yesterday morning. Like, dude, what are you doing? I'm just playing Dead Letter Dawn. What is it?
Red Dead Redemption. Or it's like you forget what time the show starts.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I'm doing Red Dead Redemption. All right, listen, can you get over here in an hour? We need you to ask some questions. And he's like, okay. And he showed up. This is what he came up with to try and make it seem like the irregular line of channels to Ukraine was not irregular.
Ambassador Taylor, I want to turn to the discussion of the irregular channel you described. And in fairness, this irregular channel of diplomacy, it's not as outlandish as it could be. Is that correct?
It's not as outlandish as it could be. Yeah, I agree, Mr.
Okay, we have.
There you go. That's it. That's his big point that he scored. It's not as outlandish as it could be. And then the rest of what the Republicans did, like I say, they outlined that Hunter Biden getting this job, he was clearly just trading on his name. But that was about as far as they got. And then they just started spewing off a bunch of different random conspiracy theories that only have salience on Fox News. And I think it wasn't even cohesive enough for Fox News to present it as much as them just saying that it was boring.
Ask about Bleach Bit.
Nobody said Bleach Bit. Nobody. Here is and the other points that the Republicans brought up was that ultimately there's no crime because the aid was released and they didn't have to announce that they were going to investigate Biden. But here is Representative Raja Krishnamurti. I'm not sure where he's from, but from Illinois, making the point as to why the funds were ultimately released.
Colleagues also say that the hold on U.S. security assistance was lifted on September 11th without any investigations happening on the part of the Ukrainians, and therefore everything ended up fine in the end. However, Mr. Kent, as you know, the House Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and Oversight Committees began this current investigation leading to the proceedings today on September 9th. In fact, it was only 2 days after this particular set of committees began their investigations that the Trump administration eventually released the military aid, correct?
That is a timeline, yes.
There you go. The reason why they didn't get a chance to commit the crime was because the investigation started and they realized, like, oh, we got caught. Your Honor, they had the weapons. They were in the car. They were walking towards the bank. They told the teller to hold, this is a stick up. Put the money in the bag. But they never made it out of the bank because a whole team of police officers came in. So no crime. Nothing wrong. Nothing to see here. That's the argument that the Republicans made and easily knocked down. The other argument that they were making is that we haven't heard from the whistleblower. Now, this is really problematic because the only other argument they made was, okay, Mr. Kent, Mr. Taylor, what you're telling us is damning, but you don't have any firsthand knowledge that this was coming from the president. None of you have never met the president. This is all hearsay. And the both of them were like, look, we were called here to tell what we know. And what we know is that there was this other channel. We know that for a fact. We know what this other channel was doing. Do we know if the president told them directly? We don't know. We're only just going by what we've seen. There's two problems with that argument. One is that the reason why you don't have firsthand people there, like Mick Mulvaney, like Rick Perry, like Rudy Giuliani, is because the White House won't let them talk. The reason why you don't have the documents is because the State Department won't release them. So if you're worried about hearsay, then the White House should have and allow testimony from the firsthand players. But if you're also worried about hearsay, why would you care that the whistleblower comes? Because the whistleblower report was all from what they heard from people who are already testifying. So on one hand, hearsay is wrong. On the other hand, we can't go anywhere without the hearsay testimony of the whistleblower. Here's Jim Jordan, the man who covers for sexual predators of student athletes, saying, how come we're not hearing from where this all started? And Peter Welch from Vermont has a good response for him.
We will never get the chance. We will never get the chance to see the whistleblower raise his right hand, swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. We'll never get that chance. More importantly, the American people won't get that chance. This anonymous so-called whistleblower with no firsthand knowledge, who's biased against the president, who worked with Joe Biden, who is the reason we're all sitting here today, will never get a chance to question that individual. Democrats are trying to impeach the president based on all that, 11 and a half months before an election. We'll not get to check out his credibility, his motivations, his bias. I said this last week, but this is a sad day. This is a sad day for this country. You think about what the Democrats have put our nation through for the last 3 years. Started July of 2016 when they spied on 2 American citizens associated with the presidential campaign and all that unfolded with the Mueller investigation after that. And when that didn't work, here we are. Based on this, the American people see through all this. They understand the facts support the president. They understand this process is unfair, and they see through the whole darn sham. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Welch. Thank you. I say to my colleague, I'd be glad to have the person who started it all come in and testify. President Trump is welcome to take a seat right there.
There you go. But there is a material problem with the argument that you need to hear from the whistleblower, because the whistleblower, all they did was collect testimony or statements, and he became aware of statements that were made by all the people who are coming in and testifying. So
it's just release the memo all over again.
Of course. There has to be something, and this is, again, there are 2 separate narratives that are at play here. And there's the right-wing Republican narrative, and then there's the other narrative that really is ultimately just going to box in Republican senators running in purple states. Those are the 2 real operative issues when we talk about this impeachment, at least in terms of like pure politics. Here is one salvo in an attempt to explain these damning facts for Donald Trump. This is clip number 9. If you know that the facts to any sort of sentient human being are incredibly damning for Donald Trump, if you know that anyone with half a brain who spends any time looking at this, and a bunch of people may not, that this looks like bribery or extortion, which is specifically named as an impeachable offense in the Constitution. You don't have to reach criminal standards because it's not a criminal proceeding. It's a political proceeding. What do you say? Well, you start to sort of fantasize and create some notion of like, well, there can't possibly be any type of, bribery here, because what if the person who is offering the bribe is so mentally incompetent that he's not aware that he's even offering a bribe? He doesn't even know what words he's stringing together. Could you possibly sell that to anybody? Who could be so naive as to think they could sell that to anybody? Oh.
Is it illegal or impeachable for the president to want things that he wants investigated? Not necessarily. I mean, not really. Not unless what you're talking about is the president really attempting to leverage American foreign aid on behalf of his electoral results. Purely. Not as a side effect of foreign policy. Purely because he wanted Biden out. Right? And that part, honestly, I don't actually see that in Trump's activity. People don't believe me when I say this, obviously, and you shouldn't, right? I mean, because the fact is, I am a conservative. Yeah, I'm a Republican. But the fact is, I don't actually see objectively that Trump has ever had the level of intent necessary to do anything. Right? I don't think that he's ever had the level of intent to eat a hamburger. I think that it's half accident when he eats a hamburger. I guess the idea here is that Trump, like a laser beam, focused in on Joe Biden. Then he was like, I'm going to withhold military aid.
Pause it. What is the mental hill that you got to climb if you're Donald Trump to focus in like a laser beam on Joe Biden? He is the Democratic primary front runner who is winning, at least in the polls. Like, what kind of
laser focus?
Like, how could I? That's the way I'm using special powers to isolate that individual.
It's my special
in
business
America.
powers.
That's what he's characterizing this as. Continue.
Like a laser beam focused in on Joe Biden. Then he was like, I'm going to withhold military aid to get Joe Biden because Joe Biden is just so dangerous. And I have been following this Burisma thing like a hawk.
No,
Pause it.
I was just going to say, it's because what he thinks about when he thinks of Ukraine is Joe Biden scandals. Because that's how his brain works.
And look, he doesn't know anything about Burisma except for it's associated with Joe Biden, just like Ben Shapiro or me, for that matter. I don't know anything about Burisma. It's just a word. Like, are you kidding? Like, he can't come up with the word Burisma. He knows about bleach pants or bleach server or whatever the hell it is. You don't have to be a laser focused. All you need to do is just hang on one word: Burisma, Biden's. That's all you have to do. It's really basically a crowd strike.
Joe Biden, because Joe Biden is just so dangerous. And I have been following this Burisma thing like a hawk. Or alternatively, he has thoughts and he vomits the thoughts whenever he is asked about a particular topic. Which one sounds more like Trump to you? Thought vomit Trump, or like a laser beam, 4D chess, planning out every move in the he's Admiral Thrawn from the post-Star Wars trilogy. Yeah, I don't think so.
First of all, there's no 4D chess here. This is the most Keystone Cops version of extortion that I've ever seen, right? They let Serpico in by letting Bill Taylor see what was going on here. They thought they were talking in code, I guess, when they were on these NSC things. There's no 4D chess here. This is pretty just naked. I'm withholding this for you to give me that. How did I come up with this Joe Biden thing?
It's shambolic the way they talk loudly enough to be overheard by staffers, actually.
Right,
there's nothing
exactly.
super sleuth
The
about
guy
this.
called on an unsecured cell phone and reached the president. The president's talking. He probably maybe had it on speakerphone. I mean, there's no 4D chess going on here. And I don't know what thought vomit is or what, but What are the chances that you could actually just randomly come up with Biden and Burisma and Ukraine? How did they piece that together if this guy's so inept? It's just absurd. They are really, really reaching here. And frankly, if that's their defense, if that's their frontline defense, like that Ben Shapiro's offering, they're in more trouble than I thought they would be. Because like I say, I don't think this is going to hurt Donald Trump. I've said since day one, he will not be thrown out of office unless he's seen on videotape naked running around the front lawn of the White House chasing, that guy in the mower meme or, that kid or some kid. But it's pretty sad that they can't come up with anything better than this. Oh, wait. Here is an attempt to come up with something better than Ben Shapiro's lame ass. Donald Trump is too mentally incompetent to actually do things like say, you can't have this.
I like how the businessman doesn't know what a bribe is.
Right, exactly.
The New York real estate guy.
Right, the New York real estate guy doesn't know what a bribe is. He doesn't know what extortion is. He doesn't know I'm going to withhold this unless I get that is. Here is the next entree into how to
agents.
Easy. That's all you need to do. You hit that. It's like telephone. You hit telephone, and that's how it happens. All right, let's play just one more clip. This is Andrew Ross Sorkin and Joe Kernan. They're really upset about the ad that apparently Elizabeth Warren is running about billionaires. And this is just, they're just shocked. Now, remember, Andrew Ross Sorkin is the guy who, when Occupy Wall Street happened, went down to cover Occupy Wall Street as a way of reporting back to CEOs and billionaires as to whether they should be afraid or not. And then he wrote about how he did that. interesting reporting style, sort of like a private reporter, if you will. But here he is. They're talking about Warren's ad that is running on CNBC, talking about billionaires.
Look, to me at least, Lee Cooperman actually wants somewhat relatively progressive tax policies.
Right.
Bill Gates wants very progressive tax policies. So the whole thing to me...
Lloyd is I argue with him all the time. He's a total lefty, but 90% of the time, I mean, now they're eating their own.
She's trying to make sure that none of them will speak out against her. This is what happens.
I mean, this is involving us now. Somehow we're part of the story, so I don't really feel like... Yeah, I would never talk about something that involved us, but I thought about it initially, and it was like, hey, if you want to reach billionaires, you advertise on CNBC. And then I thought, wait a minute, I don't know if I want those nasty people watching us. I don't want to take credit. So I don't know where to come down on any of this. But if you want the highest demo audience in TV, that's why Mercedes, that's why all these luxury goods makers advertise on CNBC. But you're not preaching to the choir. You're not in your
that class.
Right, she is. But she's not in an echo chamber. She needs to go.
She's doing it because of the echo chamber.
Because that gets picked up.
She's going to get in the other echo chamber. I understand.
Exactly.
I agree.
Here we are talking.
But I do think that the shots that she's taking, for the most part, against these individuals, for the particular people she's chosen, I mean, that's the thing. I could make a list for her.
Okay, this is sort of stunning. They're criticizing Warren for trying to appeal to the echo chamber by advertising outside of the echo chamber. Sort of losing grip on what the idea of an echo chamber is.
Yeah, the echo chamber of not billionaires.
Right. And now he's going on saying, like, they're for progressive taxation. It's unbelievable the level of, like, they can't even understand the argument that's being made here. Like, these are professionals who can't even attempt to understand the argument that's being made here. It just seems completely mystifying to them. Continue. Just another second, right?
I mean, that's the thing. I could make a list for her if she really wants.
Right.
She's
of the bad billionaires, of the ones that the greedy bad billionaires.
She's chosen very carefully anybody who's kind of said that
which billionaires? Andrew, which billionaires are? Which ones are bad? Which ones don't give it away? Which ones are not philanthropic?
Look, we've had, and what Warren Buffett has a great line that he says,
right by. I know. I used that the other day.
Criticized by category, not by name.
Right.
Yeah.
We've had all sorts of guests who've come here and have argued in favor of the carried interest.
No, they do that for a reason, not just self-interest, some of them.
And a lot of them have philosophical. All I'm saying is,
they have a lot of the guys that argue for carried interest,
but with self-interest and whatnot. I'm just saying.
No, I don't think it is self-interest.
You think there's no self-interest, but
I don't.
All I'm suggesting is
because they're giving it away anyway.
There are people who are not on her political side who have argued for tax policies that are completely antithetical to what she thinks, and I'm shocked that she doesn't go after them. Instead, she goes after the people who actually probably are more closely aligned with her.
But she's appealing.
But
these guys don't understand the basic concept of there's no way you can amass that kind of money in our society without A, having done stuff that is bad. But even if you accept that they did nothing, there was no sort of outsized pressure on government institutions. There was no breaking or bending of regulations. There was no distorting of markets to the detriment of other people. I mean, even if they just think that like it's just completely benign, the same way they go in and make money, they can't even understand that the sheer existence of individuals who control that much wealth and then, because of our system, control that much political power is problematic.
It does affect your brain when you're taking that much shoe polish that you're consuming every day.
Honestly, I would be very concerned about their physical and mental well-being.
Also, for what it's worth, since Bill Gates made the giving pledge to give away all of his wealth, he was worth $53 billion. He's now worth over $100 billion. So that indicates what it means to
Indeed,
give all your money
and
to philanthropy.
People should understand this is a zero-sum game to a large extent. If Bill Gates has all that money, that means the rest of us don't. And not just as individuals, but also as a society.
And also, Warren doesn't even take the extremist, the position I take that there shouldn't be any billionaires. She just thinks their taxes should be raised.
That's right. and she thinks that their wealth should be taxed as well.
Yeah.
She will not go on record saying that we should basically make it impossible for someone to be there. Now, the effect of her wealth tax, if it got passed, I think over time would create that dynamic. But nevertheless, all right, we're going to take a quick break. Head into the what would normally be the fun half of the show. But because of our format change today, Stephen Kinzer, Poisoner in Chief, the story of Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA search for mind control. After this, we'll just go right out, and we will see you tomorrow. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program a senior fellow at the Watson Institute at Brown University and author of Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA and the Search for Mind Control. Stephen Kinzer, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you.
So let's start, obviously, with, well, maybe we should start first with just sort of the broad strokes of the CIA's desire. If you could contextualize, I guess, for us, the context in which the CIA came to be interested in mind control.
This was an amazing project, which ultimately became known as Mkultra. Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, gave it that name because he believed, probably correctly, that if the CIA could find out a way to control people's minds, the prize would be nothing less than global mastery. So it would tower over other successes of the early Cold War, like overthrowing the government of Guatemala or overthrowing the government of Iran. He had this idea also that the Soviets were hot on the trail, or that indeed they had already discovered the secret to mind control. So, charged with this frenzy, Allen Dulles hired a most interesting guy who became the chief chemist of the CIA, and also the director of MKUltra, which under his leadership became the most methodical and farthest reaching and most brutal search for techniques of mind control that have ever been launched in history.
All right, and before we get into MKUltra and to Sidney Gottlieb, just give us a little sense of Allen Dulles. I don't know if the people, how familiar most folks are with and I think it was one of he was the longest running CIA director, I guess, at this point, and quite a character in and of himself.
Allen Dulles was a towering figure at the CIA. He dominated its early history. He came in near the very beginning. He actually helped draft the bill that created the CIA. And then all during the intense years of the Cold War, he was the CIA director. So it's difficult, of course, to piece together everything that the CIA did. And the story of MKUltra has only emerged in pieces because many of the records were destroyed in an effort to make sure that none of this ever came out. Allen Dulles, however, we can now say, was obsessed with this idea. He considered it the top priority of the CIA. And that's why he gave Sidney Gottlieb, the director of MKUltra, what amounted to a license to kill. In the course of Gottlieb's experiments, he was allowed to requisition human subjects, not just in the United States, but across Europe and in East Asia, where the CIA maintained secret detention centers where MKUltra experiments were carried out. And this network allowed Gottlieb to have essentially uncontrolled power as long as he was carrying out experiments that were aimed at doing something that he thought was a prerequisite to finding the key to mind control. Gottlieb believed, and Allen Dulles allowed him to go in this direction, that before you could find a way to insert a new mind into somebody's brain, you first had to find a way to destroy or blast away the mind that was already in there. So that was the goal of his experiments. And he spent 10 years trying to find ways to use drugs, electroshock, and all kinds of other techniques in ways that would allow him to destroy a human mind and a spirit and a body. And he did that for 10 years before finally concluding in the end, in the early 1960s, that actually mind control is a myth and the entire search had been fruitless.
All right, and we'll go through some of the details of that 10 years. But how, I'm struck by two questions. Is one is like, why specifically Sidney Gottlieb? And two, is it possible there are other Sidney Gottliebs out there that we just don't know about?
Well, first of all, you ask why Sidney Gottlieb, and that is a fascinating question because I truly believe that I have stumbled on the most powerful unknown American of the 20th century. There can't have been anybody else who was allowed the freedom to do the things that he did on his own without really having any supervision at all. So Gottlieb was brought into the CIA as a 32-year-old chemist in 1951. But he was a very different figure from just about everybody else in the top ranks of the early CIA. All of those gentlemen knew each other from the silver spoon background of the same private schools and investment banks and law firms. Gottlieb was different. He was the son of Orthodox Jewish immigrants in the Bronx. He went to City College. He limped. He stirred. He was a very different figure from the other CIA officers of that era. And he also had a very strange personal life. The way he lived was probably different from every other federal bureaucrat in 1950s Washington. He lived in a little cabin in the woods with no running water. He was into living at peace with the environment. He considered himself a compassionate humanist. He grew his own vegetables. He got up before dawn to milk his goats so he could make yogurt. He meditated. So by day, he was carrying out the most intense experiments on human subjects that have ever been conducted by any agency or officer of the U.S. government. And by night, he was living this life of the contemplative father and husband who lived off the land and were spiritually in touch with all the world around them. So he had a Jekyll and Hyde thing going in a big way. And your second question, could there be other Gottliebs? I tell you something, this story is shocking even to me. This book is my 10th book. But it's the first book I've written that I'm shocked by. I still can't believe that all of this happened. And as I've turned it over in my mind during the years I've been working on this project, naturally, I've asked myself the question that you asked. So if there was a Gottlieb then, think of how much further advanced is the secret world and how far further along the technology is, how much vaster is the computer potential. So it would be naive to think that Gottlieb, as the CIA later tried to present him, was just one crazy guy who managed to slip through the net of the CIA that normally makes sure that nothing this extreme happens. It's certainly plausible and probable, I would say, that maybe in a generation or two there'll be somebody exactly like me having a chat with somebody exactly like you, talking about something was happening in 2019, but people back then didn't know anything about.
Well, and to that point, and I want to get to the details of the story that do make it so shocking. But the But is it possible that there was other Gottliebs contemporaneous? Like, I mean, we know, I just wonder, like, they didn't do it, they certainly tried, right, to cover up all of the existence of this program. I wonder if it's possible that there were others that they were more successful with.
At the end of Gottlieb's career, he had to appear before a couple of congressional investigating committees. He was able to do this in private, and he never really had to touch any of the most sensitive things that he had done. However, he did complain that in many of the documents with which he was confronted, there were various signatures. All were blacked out and redacted, as they say, except for his. And he kept saying, why me? Why is my signature the only one that nobody ever blacked out when he decided to release these documents? And that, I think, made him reflect back on something we just talked about, which is how different he was, what an outsider he was at the CIA. I think that when the truth of MKUltra began to come out in drips and drabs, the CIA's response was to say, well, as William Colby, the CIA director, said when asked about this once by some MKUltra victims, some of our people were out of control in those days. There were problems of supervision. So essentially, this is a way to avoid all institutional responsibility and say, well, it was all Gottlieb's fault. Could there have been others? I don't think there was anybody running a program like this. Because Gottlieb had authority to travel around Europe and East Asia directing experiments like none that have ever been conducted in the U.S. government. So he really was a person who not only carried out these experiments, but conceived the entire program. Wow. And I tell you, one of his favorite drugs, his all-time favorite drug was LSD, which he himself said he used at least 200 times. And when I read that and I started reflecting on how bizarre were some of these horrific experiments that he carried out, I even asked myself, when wondering how you could conceive of these experiments, did he conceive of some of them while he was actually using LSD on his favorite drug and then letting his mind go off in this grotesque direction?
Well, let's talk about MKUltra. So it sets out he's tasked, right, with this idea of like we want you to learn how to brainwash people, but before we can implant ideas in their minds, we have to break them down. So was it did he then decide like, okay, well then I'm going to use a wide range of techniques to do it. Like, let's go through some of those. I mean, one you've touched on is just like basically dosing people, but go through the lengths in which, like, how long over the course of those 10 years was LSD like, okay, we're going to start with every patient that we have, every subject of this experiment is going to get LSD, and then we're going to do other things, or was it cocktails of different drugs, or what was his, I guess, scientific approach?
First thing he did was to ask himself, like a good scientist, what research already exists? So who's out there that's already an expert in this field? And the field is how to destroy a human mind and a soul and a human body, and how to use drugs to do that and try to control people. Well, the obvious answer was the Nazi doctors who had carried out experiments in the concentration camps. And those Nazi doctors, along with some of their Japanese counterparts, came to work for MKUltra projects. I tell you, while doing the research for this book, visited what I think was the first CIA secret prison. It's in a beautiful chalet in Germany. And the young German businessman who owns it took me down into the basement, and he said to me, these were the cells in which the MKUltra doctors and their Nazi counterparts carried out experiments that were just continuations of the experiments that those same Nazi doctors had been carrying out just a few years earlier.
Right. This is 1952.
Down the
right?
road. Exactly. We're right in the early 1950s now. So what kinds of experiments were those? So, for example, in that safe house or others like it in Germany, an experiment like this might be carried out. I found one in which people were, the victims would be placed in a sensory deprivation chamber like a coffin, and then injected with barbiturates, so they would fall into a deep coma. Then, after a period like that, they would be suddenly injected with overdoses of amphetamines that would make them hyperactive. And while they were in the transition phase between coma and hyperactivity, they were given overdoses of electroshock to see if this whole combination delivered at that moment might be something that could destroy a person's mind or kill someone. And in fact, the same German businessman I was telling you about, who owns what was then the CIA torture house, told me people in the neighborhood, the older residents, have told me that in the forests around here is where they buried the victims who were experimented to death. And most of those places are now covered by shopping malls and apartment blocks. So those were victims who the CIA documents charmingly call expendables, like refugees who nobody was connected to, or suspected enemy agents that the CIA had captured. In East Asia, many of the victims were North Korean prisoners of war. And so Gottlieb had the right essentially to requisition people to carry out experiments, and then he would go over or send other MK teams over to carry out these experiments. Now, inside the United States, Gottlieb also carried out experiments, although here he did not have the actual license to kill people because he had what was called in the CIA documents the disposal problem. He didn't have that over in the Philippines or in Korea or Japan or Germany. So he would carry out experiments often in federal prisons for obvious reasons. He liked using inmates. I found one MK experiment, for example, that was carried out in a federal prison in Kentucky. In this experiment, 7 African American inmates were segregated into a cell, and without being told what was happening to them, were given overdoses of LSD every day for 77 days. The purpose of this experiment was to find out if that amount of LSD over that long period of time could destroy a person's mind. The protocols from that experiment were among the records that have been destroyed and lost, but I strongly suspect that the answer to that experiment question was yes. I believe that, I'm sure those people's minds were destroyed, so the experiment would have been a success. What happened to them, who they were, is something I don't think we'll ever know, but it's something I still wonder about every time I think about this experiment. So these were all ways that Gottlieb tried to find a way to create a void in a human mind, only to be finally persuaded that you actually cannot ever, for example, make a person go out and commit murder if that person is deeply opposed to murder. It turned out that was a fantasy adapted from fiction and triggered by Cold War fears, but the process of pursuing that fear laid waste to many lives.
Is that what they were looking for? It's like a Manchurian Candidate where they can just, or what was it? The Boys from Brazil or Telefon or whatever it was, where it's like, we just call up. All I got to do is read get this guy on the phone and then say a poem by Thoreau, and they go off and commit some type of espionage or something.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the goals that Gottlieb was seeking, a way to program a person to commit crimes and then not only forget who had ordered him to commit the crimes, but forget that he'd even committed them at all. They were also looking for other things. For example, a truth serum. How do you get a prisoner to reveal everything that he knows? And in fact, Gottlieb was the author of the first CIA memo based on his years of experience about how to break down prisoners and make them totally reliant on the interrogator. That document in various different incarnations has gone all the way through Vietnam and Latin America and up to Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo. So in a way, MKUltra has definitely influenced the development of the techniques that we now call enhanced interrogation.
Have you, or has anyone located, I guess, subjects or victims of this? I mean, I know Whitey Bulger apparently was one of those guys who was dosed while in prison, right? Were there others? I mean, you couldn't locate those 7 African American prisoners. Were there others who gave like a firsthand account to this? I mean, I mean, I can only imagine the suffering that those 7 guys went through.
The worst of it is that, of course, nobody even knew that MKUltra existed, or that there was some guy from the CIA roaming around America and the rest of the world dosing people with LSD in various ways without their knowledge, just to observe their reactions. And nobody would have believed them if they had said so. So it wasn't until about 20 years after the experiments went on that the first news of them began to trickle out. And then at the beginning, there was a bit of series of people slowly realizing that this might have been what happened to me. And you're right, Whitey Bulger, the famous Boston gangster, was one person who came to this conclusion. He suddenly realized it. So Whitey Bulger's story is just one that we know. You can multiply this by many others. But it's one of the ways I put my book together, by trying to weave in the various stories that we have. So in Whitey Bulger's case, he was a young hoodlum in his mid-20s when he was sent to the Atlanta prison for truck hijacking. There he was approached by one Dr. Pfeiffer, a very eminent figure who was also the chief of a prominent department at Emory University. And he was asked to be one of the prisoners participating in an experiment aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. If Whitey Bulger were to cooperate, he was told that he would have better treatment in prison and good time and so forth. So he agreed. He didn't know what he was being given. All he knew was that it was something that had to do with curing schizophrenia. Well, what it was in the end, it was actually LSD. And he was fed LSD just about every day for more than a year. And later on, he wrote a detailed diary for himself after he got out of prison of what happened and how awful it was and what he used to see in his prison cell, and how since then he's had nightmares every night of his life and he can't sleep. He has to have the lights on at night. But he didn't say anything to anybody because, as he wrote in his diary, I thought if I said anything, they'd never let me out. But he's just one example. And I discovered in one book on Whitey Bulger that at one point in the 1970s, when the news about MKUltra came out, he realized that experiment had nothing to do with schizophrenia. It was a CIA experiment aimed at mind control. And he told the other gangsters that he hung out with that he was going to find that Dr. Pfeiffer. He's going to go back to Atlanta and he was going to kill him. Pfeiffer died a natural death, apparently, not so long after, so Whitey Bulger never carried out that threat. But he's an example of somebody who finally put it all together. But what he didn't know was what was behind Dr. Pfeiffer. And that's because Sidney Gottlieb, even then, was totally invisible. And part of the challenge of my book is to write a biography of a person who lived in such deep anonymity.
Tell us about Operation Midnight Climax. That is, it's quite a name.
So Gottlieb was interested in trying everything possible that had to do with drugs, and see if combinations of drugs with all kinds of other techniques might not help him understand ways to make people talk more freely and open their minds to outside control. At one point, he came up with the idea that he'd like to test the effect of mixing sex with drugs. The question was something like, was there a combination of drugs and sexual techniques that would make men speak more freely or in some way open up their brain to control? So, in pursuit of this highly scientific project, he set up a bordello in San Francisco on Telegraph Hill, and he had an agent, a very colorful federal narcotics officer, set up a ring of prostitutes who brought their clients up to this apartment and then dosed their drinks with LSD or whatever drug it was that Gottlieb wanted to try out that week. And meanwhile, Gottlieb's agent would be sitting on the other side of the one-way mirror on his portable toilet, drinking martinis out of a pitcher and writing down what he saw through the mirror. That was the extent of the deep clinical analysis. So this operation, this CIA-sponsored bordello, which was essentially your tax dollars at work trying to find a way to protect America from communism, was indeed known at the CIA as Operation Midnight Climax, and really represents one of the most bizarre extremes of Gottlieb's mind control experiment.
I mean, if they were aware of this, at the agency, like what was the perspective? Like this guy's twisted. We're all twisted. I mean, look, the whole thing. Put aside the fact that it's some guys behind a one-way mirror or two-way mirror, I guess, and recording this. I mean, what was their perspective? Was it just like, this is a project we're doing, it's going to get a little weird, but we have it at arm's length enough so that we can say this guy's a freak and he just got out of control and he wasn't filing his weekly reports properly or something?
You're not actually that far off. So at the CIA, I realized as I was investigating the project that led to this book, there's a certain culture that I think also exists at other secret services, and that is that ignorance is often an asset. You don't want to know too much. It implicates you. So at the CIA, I think there were only a very few people who had an idea of what Gottlieb was doing. Alan Dulles was certainly one. Richard Helms, who was sort of the intermediary between Gottlieb and Dulles, was another. But since those guys, Dulles and Helms in particular, understood that Gottlieb was carrying out this urgent project and that they knew this would involve experiments that would be brutal, that blood was being shed, that people were probably being killed, did not lead them to decide they needed to supervise this much more carefully. It led them to the contrary conclusion. Since we know in our heart that these things are happening, we don't want to ask any questions. This is so important, that's why it's called Mkultra, that the loss of a few lives or a few hundred lives is certainly a small price to pay. Meanwhile, by not asking too many questions, we insulate ourselves and allow ourselves in the future to say we didn't know anything. So in this way, Gottlieb essentially worked without any supervision. I do think there would have been a mind control project, something like Mkultra, without Dulles and Gottlieb, but it wouldn't have gone to such crazy extremes. And this is really an example of how far the project was allowed to go based on the misplaced terrors of that age.
So aside from the story being, completely nuts and it being incredibly compelling, when you look back on this chapter, but the entire saga, what is what are the lessons that you take from it? Are they narrowly tailored to just the CIA? Is it about sort of the way that people wash themselves of responsibility? What's the big takeaway?
I think that the ultimate justification for committing immoral acts is commitment to a great cause. Patriotism is one of the most transcendent and seductive of all causes. Gottlieb lived at a time in which all Americans were led to believe that we were at the moment of imminent destruction and that therefore any sacrifice was necessary. In a way, that could be a little bit of a message for us today. We too now are being told that we're at a moment of special emergency and our country faces threats. Therefore, although we normally behave according to all international rules of ethics and morality, because of the emergency we face now, temporarily we have to give up some of our normal virtues and carry out operations in other countries that we might not otherwise have to do, and we have to give up certain civil liberties at home. So it's a danger. I think Gottlieb lost sight of an elemental moral calculation. You always have to ask yourself, is there an amount of evil you do in the service of what you think is a good cause, but that finally begins to outweigh the goodness of the cause? I think Gottlieb lost sight of that, and it's a message not to be carried away by the fears of the moment and lose one's bearings by thinking that any sacrifice is now necessary. Once you do that, especially when secret agencies do it, you begin to go down a path in which human life is devalued, and so is democracy.
Yeah, and it's arguable that Gottlieb made any sacrifices. It sounds like there was those sacrifices were offloaded to a lot of people who weren't even aware that they were making them. The book is Poisoner in Chief, Sidney Gottlieb and the CIA Search for Mind Control. Stephen Kinzer, thanks so much for your time today. We will put a link to that book at majority.fm. Real pleasure, fascinating story.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar, but finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid.